Thank you to Brigadier General Chico Tamir. We would like to begin this process this overall approach we consolidated in the Institute with a simple question. What is our national goal, which is of course connected to the Israeli-Palestinian issue? And to that end, I assume that what we said at the beginning of the session will be acceptable to only part of the people sitting here, but we believe that the status quo and deadlock are bringing us to a place where we don't want to be if we want to relate to the basic values upon which the State of Israel was established. If we wish to reach the goal of a Jewish and democratic state, the vision of the Declaration of Independence for the purpose of the discussion, to live within safe borders, we wish to examine a number of channels on which we can work in parallel. I will start with the regional channel, about which we have heard the Minister of Defense speak quite extensively. There is today an increasing overlapping of interests between Israel and regional countries, especially Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia, and the United Emirates. We are facing a number of challenges, and each of those countries, some more and some less, is facing challenges which are not unlike the challenges that we are concerned by. And so there is a kind of possible partnership that we can build on. We are facing a nuclearizing Iran. We are facing the rise of ISIS and radical Islam. And we are facing Hamas and Palestinian terror and the smuggling of arms and the illegal crossings of borders on not only on our borders. And in addition to those challenges, which we can say are shared by all the countries that I've mentioned, all of those countries and perhaps others support an arrangement or settlement in the spirit of the Arab Initiative of 2002. So I'd like to mention a number of principles that I believe Israel can view as positive principles. For example, choosing peace as a strategic choice, direct negotiations with Israel. This is, of course, is implied by Resolution 181 of the United Nations. There is an Arab commitment in the Arab Peace Initiative to advance this initiative in the international community outside the Arab world and the Middle East. There is an agreement to a political solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and normalization with Israel. There is agreement or a proposal to find an agreed-upon solution in regard to the matter of the Palestinian refugees. So we may have here an opportunity to recruit those countries I mentioned to lead an agenda that could help and not only that, and not only advancing the resolution of the Israeli-Arab conflict, but this is, we used a kind of GPS navigation system, so it would be a little bit easier to understand what we're saying and why this session is called Recalculating the Route. And here, too, this could lead to a dialogue which leads nowhere, or perhaps a change in the circumstances that will ultimately not make it possible to move this channel forward, and the regional dialogue may fade out or perhaps never even ever start. And so we look for alternative routes. One of them that we wish to propose is that of negotiations, bilateral negotiations. We're in favor of renewing the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations with the Palestinian Authority. We're in favor of moving ahead gradually by means of interim agreements and partial agreements to a reality of two states for two peoples, even in the absence of an agreement or even in the absence of progress on the other channels. We believe that something of the spirit of the Clinton outline of 2000 or the roadmap of 2003 of the Quartet and President Bush could serve as formal outlines. They are not initiatives. They are not independent or private individuals of people who are going to take responsibility for implementation. And so we believe that re-entering negotiations in order to implement in its context understandings for agreements, even if they are not full agreements, even if they are only partial agreements, but they work in accordance with the formula of what has been understood to have been agreed or coordinated mutually will be implemented, and not that everything must be agreed upon. Nothing will be done before everything has been agreed in. For the past, as we saw in the past 15 years via Camp David and Taba and Annapolis, we wish to change the process in order to see the real change on the ground. And of course, this bilateral track must be conditioned at least on the abandonment of the lawfare on the international stage that the Palestinians are engaged in. This is, of course, a gross violation of the Oslo agreements. No need to explain that. And Gaza must be rebuilt, and we must strengthen our security relations to prevent Hamas terror with Egypt. And we must support what the defense minister discussed, and in what Chico Tomer just said, we must support the continued building of the Palestinian institutions and the moderate leadership. These two channels that I have discussed until now ultimately represent a partnership initiated by Israel with some very important partners in order to advance with them, as well as on the Israeli-Palestinian track. We assume and we believe that it is possible to expect that progress in the relations between Israel and the Palestinians will help to moderate the de-legitimization campaign that is staining Israel's reputation throughout the world and is harming people and affecting policymakers who are normally favorable towards Israel. And this is making it difficult for us to recruit support for our policies. And of course, this channel, of course, can become deadlocked or not, perhaps not even get started for reasons that I assume we will hear about further down the line, for example, from Ambassador Indyk. A third channel, in addition to bilateral and regional dialogue, is the default. This is not an aspiration that is at the top of our priorities. It is a default to get, if the other channels become deadlocked, but we don't need to wait for that to happen. This is the perception we wish to present. We must prepare for the possibility that we will have to initiate a separation from the Palestinians by Israel. In other words, this means that the government must prepare on a national scale, on a comprehensive, sweeping scale. The government must prepare this option to withdraw to a temporary border, and the government will determine what that border will be. I'm not going to sketch it out here, but I can say that a reasonable border in such a case by an initiated withdrawal is the security fence route which goes around the large main settlement blocks, and we are talking about redeploying both civilly and military to that line, and that means that the PA receives most of the territory of the West Bank, with the exception of the Jordan Valley, where we will remain, and with the exception of the main settlement blocks, and that is until there is a final status settlement. And this means that we must consolidate a plan for national priorities for the absorption of up to 100,000 people who today live outside the lines that I have just sketched out. We must pass a law to provide suitable compensation for those settlers who will have to move back into the Green Line or into the settlement block. And it is important to explain the importance of partitioning the land, which is far more important than the alternative is to divide the people if we don't do that. And so that there be no misunderstanding, I want you to understand there is no discussion here or work on the final status. Everything that's happening in Jerusalem and with the refugees remains as it was. We are not touching these subjects when we independently separate. And that's why I think that what we are presenting here makes it possible, gives Israel maximum flexibility while maintaining its long-term interests. What we are proposing here is that Israel be proactive all the time, that it hold the initiative in its hands. What we've seen in recent years was Israel being dragged into situations, was responding and reacting late, and moving away from the goals that we have set as Israel being a Jewish democratic state within safe borders. The initiative is still in our hand. There's a combination of a number of different tracks, as I noted earlier, a regional track based on moderate Arabs that moves to negotiations over the principles of the Arab initiative with our well-known reservations, which will be voiced very, very clearly by parts of this initiative, but dialogue is dialogue. And of course, basing ourselves on the roadmap for peace of the quartet and President George W. Bush, and at the same time an Israeli-Palestinian track which will work cautiously with interim settlements and an immediate implementation of everything that has been agreed upon, and an independent move to set out the border, to separate ourselves from the Palestinians, which will already move in the direction of the solution, of the two-state solution, because that's the direction we're moving in. In that way, we'll be able to reach our goal. I remind you, the goal is that of a national home that is democratic and safe for the Jewish people, alongside a demilitarized Palestinian state. I would like now to call upon the next speaker, Tamar Asraf, who is the spokesperson of the Benjamin Regional Council. She's very well known among the settlement population. She also has a blog, Settlers on the Net. She has a radio program. She lives in the community of Eli. And I am honored to call upon you, Tamar, and see if you agree with anything of what I said.